everybody, it's Emily at Arg Schooling, and today I wanted to do a sort of summer reading review. So I want to talk a little bit about what I read over the summer, but I'm not going to go in we're not going to talk about every single book because that would just take forever. I read 40 books between June and August, and of those, we're going to start, I'm going to give you a little breakdown of what I read, and we'll talk about my favorites. So, of those 40 books, I had 10 five-star reads. And those 10 five-star reads were The 10th Mistake of Hank Huberman by Jennifer Chaldanko, which is realistic middle grade fiction about a boy who has to become the parent because his mother isn't there for them. I read The Radium Girls by Kate Moore, which is historical nonfiction, and this is about a really fascinating case of science gone wrong in the business world. And then I read The Woman They Could Not Silence, also by Kate Moore, which is another historical nonfiction book. I read those almost back to back, and that one is about a really amazing woman who was put into an asylum, who's wrongly put into asylum, and it's all about how women were treated in that time period and how this one woman kind of stood up for all the women who were being put into this unfair position. Then I read Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay, which is a horror novel about a cursed film. I read Fantastic Land by Mike Bakoven, which is a found footage sort of kind of book. I don't even know how to describe it. I guess found footage would be a good way to describe it. About a really horrendous storm that caused a bunch of people to be trapped in an amusement park and all of the chaos that happens because of that. Then I had The Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is a graphic novel memoir about the author's childhood and adolescence growing up after the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Then I read The Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler, which is a sequel to Parable of the Sower. And this is a dystopian story about a near future in which it looks too much like our current trajectory. So it's really good, but very unsettling. I read As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katu, which is a historical, speculative fiction book set during the Syrian Revolution. And this one follows a girl trying to get out of the country and get to safety. And then I read The Night War by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, which is a middle grade historical fantasy about a young Jewish girl in France trying to evade the Nazis and find her family. And then finally I have When We Flew Away by Alice Hoffman, which is another middle grade historical fiction. This one is about Anne Frank in the years leading up to them having to go into hiding. So those are my five-star reads. But now let's talk about genre breakdown. So I read 11 middle grade and YA books. I read 10 historical fiction books. I read 9 speculative fantasy and sci-fi books. I read 7 horror novels. And I read 5 nonfiction books. Of all the 40 books that I read, 25 of them were things that were already on my shelves, which isn't terrible. It's more than half. I'm really working on reading my shelves, so that was something that I've been really focusing on this year in particular, just really trying to focus on reading the things that I already own. But of course, I also read a lot of ARCs and ebooks and audiobooks and library books and things like that. So 13 of the books that I read over the summer were all new releases. And of course, I also, every time you see me do a TBR, I choose something from my TBR jar. Now, these are prompts that I created to, again, help me read the things I already own, the things that are already on my shelves, because I am really bad about purchasing books and then never getting to them. So this is something that the last 2 years I've been really focused on. So the TBR jar selections that I chose, the month of June was fantasy, and I only read one, which honestly, I'm okay with, because fantasy is something that I don't necessarily gravitate towards very often. So even to just get one of them off my shelves read was good for me. Then in July, I decided not to pick something for my TBR, but rather back up and read the things that were on my TBR earlier in the year that I didn't get to. So it was a TBR catch-up, and I read 7 of those, which is very good for me. Like, I'm impressed that I did that, because usually if I say I'm going to read something and I don't get to it, it just lingers. It lingers on my TBR forever. So it might even show up in multiple TBRs until I eventually just go, fine, never mind, and put it back on the shelf. So I read 7 books that I had meant to read earlier in the year. And then last month in August, my TBR selection was cults. And I only read 2, but I didn't like either of the ones that I picked, so I kind of decided I didn't want to pick another one and put myself into a reading slump. So I stopped at 2. But I do have some things that I'm like, maybe I would like that, so perhaps at some point I'll do another catch-up video and I'll try to get to those. So of the 40 books that I read, I have a few standouts. These are the things that will probably show up in my top 10 at the end of the year, perhaps. So first up is The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore. This was a book club selection. We read it together, and I'm so glad that we did, because we had so much to talk about. This is a story about a really amazing woman who none of us had ever heard of, which is shocking, because she did so much for women in America in this time period. We're talking the 1800s, around the Civil War, that time period. And women at that time could be put into an asylum for absolutely no reason at all. Maybe they speak up too much. Maybe they don't agree with their husband. Maybe they talk too much, like things like that. And these women were just languishing in asylums for absolutely no reason, taken away from their children, taken away from their families and friends, and just forced into this isolated place where they were sometimes abused and tortured. So she was put into an asylum for speaking up, and it did not make her stop talking. It did not make her quiet. It made her more angry and just desperate to get her voice heard. And she did so much. She wrote a book. She spoke up and convinced people that this was wrong, and laws were passed because of it. So she's fascinating. I loved this book, and I just found it super inspiring. And then, of course, Fantastic Land is probably one of my absolute favorite horror novels that I've read this year. This is a disaster story, and I usually enjoy things like that. I almost want to call it dystopian. It's not really, but it kind of feels a little dystopian, because it's dystopian on a smaller scale. Because this is a story about a theme park that's called Fantastic Land. These people get trapped inside. It's mostly the people who work there, and they're trapped during a hurricane. And so they can't get out. Everything's shut down. No one's coming to help them. And it's a series of interviews in which they are telling the story about what happened during this event. And I listened to the audiobook, and maybe the audiobook is what made it a 5-star for me. I don't know, because I've read things similar to this before and not enjoyed them nearly as much. Like, I read World War Z many years ago, and I thought it was fine, and it's told in a very similar format. But I just found, like, none of the voices really stood out. Everyone kind of felt very similar. It didn't really work for me. The audiobook of Fantastic Land is so good. Everybody has a different narrator. They all sound really distinctly different. Everybody's story just like comes to life even more because of the narrators. And I just thought the audiobook was phenomenal. And if you're going to read Fantastic Land, I highly recommend the audio for this reason alone. I think the audio was just phenomenal. I really enjoyed this. I thought the story of like the societal breakdown in this format, like in this like small group setting, was really interesting to read. The people who became monsters, or people you wouldn't necessarily expect, and sometimes they were, the people who became heroes, again, people you wouldn't necessarily expect. So I just think it was really interesting to read. Then another favorite of the summer was Parable of the Talents. I had been putting this book off because I found the first book really good, but really unsettling, especially in the fact that it's set so close to now. Like, this book is set over the course of like the 2030s. The first book opens in 2023 and 2024 and stuff, so like it's too soon. And so reading about this like dystopian nightmare setting that sounds too close to what we're living right now, like the president in this second book is eerily similar to Trump, and it's just it's a lot to take in, let me tell you. But it was so good. I don't even know how to talk about it, honestly. I don't think I'm smart enough to like dissect it, but I just found it really interesting the way in this book you're getting the story of Lauren Olamina from her own perspective still, but you're also getting the perspective from her daughter's point of view. And she's telling about her mother, and she's never really known her mother because she was taken from her so young, but she's learned about her, and she's telling about what she's found out. So like you're getting a story about Lauren like secondhand from a person who never met her, but you're also getting Lauren's perspective too. So you're getting this like much different version of events than you would if it was just from her perspective. I don't know. I just found that aspect really, really well done. I don't know. I kind of want to read these both again. Weirdly, the first book I found so unsettling and like disturbing, but the second book I found almost hopeful and reassuring in some way. So I don't know. I want to just Earthseed. Earthseed itself is so fascinating. I love reading about like the beginnings and foundings of religions. That's not something that I would have guessed that I would enjoy, but oh my gosh. This is like one of the best versions of that I can think of. Like the way she talks about Earthseed, the way Earthseed was created, the way it develops, and she builds this like following. I just found it all really neat to read about. I really enjoyed that. Okay, and then the last book I want to talk about, the last of my favorites, was When We Flew Away by Alice Hoffman. This one I've talked about a lot recently, so I'm not going to go into a ton of depth, but this was really good and way better than I expected. I was a little bit hesitant because it is Anne Frank, and I'm somewhat protective of Anne Frank, and I didn't want to see her story written wrong. I don't know. Wrong's not the word, but you know. But Alice Hoffman did not disappoint me. Like, her writing is stunning always, and this was just so beautiful to read. I'm so excited to get my own copy. I read The Ark because it's not out yet. This doesn't come out until the 17th of September. So I'm excited to get my own copy so I can go in and annotate it, because I had so many highlights in The Ark. So many just gorgeous lines. And so I'm very excited to like own a copy and annotate it so I can like reflect back on it again. But this is a story about Anne Frank starting around the age of like 11 and a half, right before she turns 12. So it's her family has moved to Amsterdam to escape the Nazis in Germany, and they think Amsterdam will be safer. Because in theory it was, until it wasn't. And then it was like, how are we going to get out? What are we going to do? And so it talks a lot about like how her father was trying to get them visas so they could go to America, or they could go to England or somewhere. He had the opportunity to send the girls to England, but he didn't want to because he wanted them to be able to stay together. And like, he had no idea that it was going to be as bad as it was. So and how do you know? How can you possibly know? So he declined doing that, and he had family and friends in America, and he still could not secure visas for them to go there. And so there's like a lot of them talking about what will they do once they're in America and that kind of thing. And it's just, it's hard. It's hard to read a book like this because you know the outcome, and you're watching Anne develop into a person, and like, what does she want to do with her life? What is her first love? Her developing her writing skills and learning more about like how she wants to be a writer, and coming up with these ideas about how she wants to do something with her life. She wants to be somebody, and it's beautiful, and I recommend it, but just know that it's sad. It's a sad book, and it's going to leave you feeling a lot of emotions, but I'm glad that I read it, and I cannot wait to get my copy. So that's my like summer reading in review. Let me know down below, should I do this every season? I mean to every year, and then I never get around to it. So should I do that? Would you be interested in seeing this kind of video going forward? And maybe I'll do it again in the end of the fall. Let me know down below in the comments, what was like a standout book for you that you read over the summer? I'd love to hear about it. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.